Good morning, everyone. This is Penny from Wisconsin Land & Water, and thank you for joining us today for the Establishing Pollinator Habitat on Organic Farms webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Caleb.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the second in 3 of organic webinar series for summer 2019. Today we are doing a webinar on pollinator conservation opportunities on organic farms. Karin Jokela will be our presenter today, as well as myself, Caleb Langworthy, working with Moses.
Hi everybody, this is Karin. I just want to first say a few things about the organization that I work for, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We are a nonprofit science-based organization that works to protect invertebrates and their habitats. We are based out of Portland, Oregon, but we have staff all over the country. I am based in Minnesota and I cover ground in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and I'm part of a program called the Pollinator and Agricultural Biodiversity Program. That is our largest program, and we have the most staff on the ground doing pollinator work. My position is funded by a partnership between the Xerces Society, NRCS, and General Mills. I am essentially a contract biologist, and I work with NRCS field offices, individual farmers, and at the state level to do anything and everything related to pollinator technical assistance. So I will help design seed mixes, I help evaluate habitat on the ground, I help revise state standards for pollinator cover crops and pollinator program guidelines, kind of a little bit of everything. And I work in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but I also have a counterpart in Iowa, and we also have a few other partner biologists, one in North Dakota, Nebraska, California, and Maine.
And I am Caleb Langworthy, and I work on a contribution agreement between NRCS and Moses, the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service, whose mission is to educate, inspire, and empower farmers to thrive in a sustainable organic system of agriculture. Moses is based out of Spring Valley, Wisconsin, and is best known for their annual organic farming conference that draws over 3,000 industry professionals and farmers to La Crosse for the last weekend in February every year.
All right, I want to just give us a sense of where we're going in this webinar. Caleb is going to talk about the National Organic Program and the regulations that come with it, and basically outline why organic farmers are required to conserve biodiversity and natural resources on their farms. I will talk a little bit about some of the on-farm habitat evaluation tools that NRCS has available to use and or is required to use. Caleb will again talk about some NRCS programs and how they kind of crosswalk with the organic systems plan that is required by organic farmers. And then I will discuss some of the NRCS pollinator initiatives, a little bit about organic site prep methods for pollinator habitat establishment, and then we will both discuss some additional resources and training opportunities that are coming your way.
Great. Thanks. I just wanted to start by highlighting the definition of organic production by the USDA. So it is a production system that is managed to respond to site-specific conditions, integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster the cycling of resources, promotes ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. I just wanted to highlight this as it's just right in the definition of organic, that organic farms should be striving for similar outcomes as conservation officials through fostering of resources and promoting ecological balance and biodiversity conservation. And in the National Organic Program's regulations, they have a natural resource regulation that says, in part, that a producer must maintain or improve the natural resources of an operation, including soil and water quality. Now, there was some concern about a vague definition of what natural resources were in the National Organic Program. So in response to those requests for clarity over what constitutes natural resources of an operation, the NOP, with help from the NRCS, issued a guidance on natural resources and biodiversity in 2016. And in it, it defined natural resources as the physical, hydrological, and biological features of a production operation, including soil, water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. In that guidance, we found out that certified organic operations are required to implement measures that support natural resource conservation and biodiversity, in addition to maintaining soil or water quality. Also in that guidance, we learned that the producer must initiate the practices to support biodiversity and to avoid activities that would diminish it. We also learned that compliance with the NOP regulations requires that the organic producer incorporates practices beneficial to biodiversity in the organic systems plan, that initial plan that all certified operations need to obtain certification. Producers must also select, carry out, and record the production practices that maintain or improve those natural resources to satisfy the natural resource concerns of their organic systems plan. We also learned in that 2016 guidance that non-certified land adjacent to an organic operation undergoing conservation counts if it can be inspected and it contributes benefits to that certified land. In that 2016 guidance, we learned that conservation plans developed with NRCS can be submitted as the natural resource portion of an organic systems plan, and that organic certifiers are required to accept those plans. One of those plans for transitioning to organic production is CAP 138, and that whole plan developed by NRCS or TSP can be submitted to satisfy the natural resources portion of an organic systems plan. And I just wanted to point out a really helpful guide in the back of that 2016 guidance. There's a multi-page appendix that provides examples of activities that would satisfy the NOP requirement and where NRCS assistance may be available for that. One of the practices that could apply today would be under wildlife benefits. And I just wanted to point out the top one there, maintaining or improving diverse mixtures of plants to provide food, habitat, or shelters for pollinators, insects, spiders, and other beneficial organisms such as arthropods, bats, and raptors. So pretty low-hanging fruit for NRCS and organic farmers to achieve.
Okay, so how does this come back to pollinators and their conservation? And I think a baseline for starting here is to talk about the differences between honeybees and our native wild bees. So when we think of pollinator conservation, probably most of you conjure up an image of a honeybee, but really these honeybees are European species that were brought over to this continent hundreds of years ago for agricultural purposes, and they are good at pollinating things. We need those services, no doubt. But they are managed by humans. The nests are provided for them. They're social, and importantly, they are not at risk of extinction. Whereas our native bees, we have documented over 460 species in the upper Midwest. We're still counting, still getting to know who lives here, and many of them are at risk of extinction. Most of these are not managed by humans. They're nesting in the wild, either in the ground or stems or wood. They're just solitary, small nests, and they are all around us and visiting many of our crops and providing important pollination services. So when there's an organic mandate for biodiversity conservation, and we put that into the context of pollinator conservation, we should be thinking about ways to support habitat for this broad diversity of wild bees, and not just thinking about habitat that would support honeybees. And if you take that a step further, thinking about this organic mandate for biodiversity conservation, whatever pollinator habitat we build on farms is also doing an important role of attracting beneficial insects that can serve as natural enemies for our pests. There's a lot of research that has gone into this and into the importance of natural enemies. And some research shows that if over 25 or 20% of the farm is in habitat, pest control, it can really be sufficient throughout all of the fields. And so building pollinator habitat really brings along this whole group of other, the rest of the biodiversity in the invertebrates. So boiling it down to what are those basic requirements for habitat for all pollinators and really a diversity of beneficial insects. They're all going to need diverse plants, whether that's a host plant, and you can think about like a monarch caterpillar, they need specific species to grow on, or wild bees, they're going to need a diversity of season-long forage for pollen and nectar for food. Some of those bees are only flying for a short period. They're dependent on one type of flower. Some of them, like bumblebees, are flying all season long and need diverse bloom from early May all the way into late October, depending on kind of the season. They also, all of these invertebrates need shelter. So whether that's shelter for overwintering, so undisturbed areas either in litter, like leaf litter, or in the stems of trees and forbs, grasses. They need kind of some protected areas that are not disturbed, areas that are free from grazing or burning or haying or tillage, importantly. So that doesn't mean that we should abandon all of those disturbance techniques, but some areas need to, in each given year, need to be protected from that disturbance. And then, of course, all of these invertebrates, if we're trying to conserve them on the farm, they need protection from pesticides. Importantly, insecticides that are directly impacting them, but they also should be, protected from fungicides and herbicides that might indirectly be impacting their environment. So that's the baseline. How do we actually assess habitat once we're working with an individual farmer? This is kind of the bulk of my job. And this is what I do for when I work with a farmer. I'm out there kind of looking at the habitat and recognizing what already is there, and then figuring out what isn't there, identifying those deficiencies, and prioritizing habitat improvements that actually meet those deficiencies. And so I think a lot of farmers and even conservation planners, when they think about pollinator habitat, they think of a wildflower meadow. But actually, pollinator habitat can really come in a wide variety of forms. So I like to use this illustration. It's on the inside of one of our Xerces pollinator conservation brochures called Farming for Pollinators. And I like it because I'm a very visual person. It helps me identify those elements of a farm that I might not immediately recognize as pollinator habitat, but really are serving an important role. So you can see here, there's a riparian area, there's some wet edges along a pond, there's some marginal areas that might just be field borders, there are windbreaks, even little plots in a garden can be important pollinator habitat. Rock piles, large areas of cover crops in the background, even understory planting. So in this image, there's looks like an orchard. You could have an understory planting in the orchard, or you could think of that as a woodland that might have really valuable understory herbaceous vegetation. And so the important thing when you're working with a farmer, especially an organic farmer that's required to maintain biodiversity, is to recognize some of these areas and conserve those first before you go in trying to just throw in new habitat features, because some of these are really providing important nesting sites and forage resources that we might not really be recognizing. So one tool that I use a lot when working with farmers is this pollinator habitat assessment form and guide. And you should know that we have two other versions of this assessment form. One is for natural areas and rangelands, and another one is specifically for beneficial insect habitat. So if those are your target kind of species, then you might want to use a different version of this guide. But basically, this walks through systematically. It helps you walk through the farm and think about the landscape features in a way that kind of teases out some of those things that you might not be paying attention to. So at first it asks you to look at the entire landscape surrounding the farm. And then it drills down to what's going on the farm. So farmscape features might be things like pasture or woodland or cropland, kind of what are the different components of the farm and how might those be contributing to both biodiversity and pollinator habitat. And then it goes into these other sections, foraging habitat, nesting habitat, and farm management practices. So in that foraging habitat section, it will pull apart, how much spring blooming forage do you have? How much summer forage do you have, and fall? And what I find working with a lot of farmers is that there's a spring bloom gap. Maybe there's just dandelions in the spring, but the rest of the season they have tons of floral resources. And so this guide helps me pull apart where are those deficiencies so that when we're building new habitat and spending, frankly, taxpayer dollars on building new habitat, we can do it in a really strategic and meaningful way. Another tool you should be aware of, especially if you are trying to build monarch habitat on farms, you should be aware of this Monarch Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide. Many of you who have been using the CSP program probably are becoming familiar with this Habitat Evaluation Guide, the WHEG. And what I should say is that it can look a little daunting when you look at this tool. There's a lot of built-in formulas, but the good news is that there's a way to rapidly assess and give a poor condition ranking to many habitat types where you might think about putting in new pollinator meadows. Cropland, monotypic grasses or legumes like an alfalfa stand, brush where there's just overgrown cedar, box elder, or ash, all of those are basically simple, poor condition ranking areas, and you can just move quickly to the next step of conservation planning. But if you have an area that is primarily an herbaceous community, maybe has some milkweed, some goldenrod, that's when you actually have to do this Monarch WHEG and evaluate the insecticide risk of the forb cover and richness, milkweed stem density, etc., to evaluate whether that stand is in poor condition, good condition, excellent, and so forth. And I guess I'll just leave it there. You should know about this tool, but if you have specific questions, this is the kind of thing that I'm available to help with in the field. And then how does this tie back into some of these organic resources that NRCS offers? I'll leave that to Caleb.
I just wanted to point out that NRCS put together a great handbook for working with organic farmers, and it's conservation for organic farmers, and it's available on the NRCS website. So NRCS and then /organic. And one tool in particular that I wanted to point out on the Conservation for Organic Farmers webpage that NRCS has, down there in the bottom right-hand corner under Technical and Financial Assistance. If you click on that, it will bring you to another page full of resources. And down at the bottom of that page is the National Organic Program regulations, as written in 2052, and how those regulations, well, it's a crosswalk with NRCS conservation practice standards and enhancements. And if we just take a look at it, it's an Excel spreadsheet. Right now, I have a screenshot of NOP regulation for establishing physical barriers to prevent commingling of organic and non-organic products, and to have fields distinct that require defined boundaries and buffer zones, such as runoff diversions and activities that intercept windborne particles to prevent the unintended application of a prohibited substance. So we can see the conservation practice codes that would meet that National Organic Program regulation, and the CSP enhancements that could also fit that regulation. Something I also want to point out here is that Wild Farm Alliance developed a wonderful guide that is very helpful if you're working for or with organic farmers. It's available on Wild Farm Alliance's website. It's a free download. I believe they have a physical copy of that book that's available for a pretty reasonable fee as well. Is also a great guide for working with organic farmers.
So once you've used that crosswalk and you've identified some of the conservation practices that might apply on organic farms to help them meet their biodiversity requirements, you can also lean on this tool, and I use this tool a lot. It is a National Biology Tech Note 78, and now I realize I'm posting something that says 2014 Farm Bill programs. However, the content is essentially the same for the 2018 Farm Bill programs. The content is as relevant now as it was 12 months ago, and I assure you that our Xerces team is working right now to revise this document so that it can have a new title, 2018 Farm Bill Programs, and we can go forth using it. But get familiar with this. This is a really neat tech note that outlines all the different NRCS programs and FSA programs that would help with pollinator habitat development. It explains what the programs are, who would be eligible for it, what kind of the payment scenarios might look like, and who should kind of participate. It even outlines which, for example, which EQIP programs, environmental quality incentive programs, might be best used if you were trying to develop more forage resources or more nesting habitat. So it's a really neat tool that I encourage you to get familiar with. So I'll just start off with some of these programs that are outlined in the Farm Bill and in that tech note and in that crosswalk that might help farmers address their biodiversity requirements through the organic program. The first, most, far and wide, this is the most used program for putting in pollinator habitat, maybe apart from CRP. But EQIP is a program that addresses specific natural resource concerns on ag land. The new 2018 Farm Bill actually allocates 10% of funds in the EQIP program must go to improving or creating wildlife habitat. This is up from 5% in the last Farm Bill. So this pollinator habitat is absolutely wildlife habitat, and so hopefully a lot of applications for pollinator habitat can get funding. So within the EQIP program, there are a lot of different conservation practices, up to 200 depending on where you're living. If it's anywhere in the Midwest, there are about 200 different scenarios. Within each conservation practice, there are multiple different payment scenarios, and we'll walk through kind of some of the variation in those. So far and wide, the most used pollinator habitat implementation practice is conservation cover 327. And the basic premise here is to establish and maintain permanent vegetation cover. There are various payment scenarios under 327. Some of them favor more of a native grass planting. Some of them are more of a native pollinator planting that has high forb requirements, 75% plus being native forbs. Some of them are oriented towards honeybees, but there are a lot of different ways to use conservation cover, especially on organic farms, for pollinator and beneficial insects. So this is an example of a blueberry farm that implemented 327 as a native forage cover. And it's really important for a lot of organic farmers that are growing specialty crops. These habitat plantings are not just aesthetic or kind of have this abstract conservation value. They're very important for bringing native pollinators into their crop for the pollination services. Not only for the pollination services, but also for that beneficial insect, the pest control services. A lot of these organic farmers that are growing specialty crops also have U-pick operations where they're inviting the public onto their farm. And so, of course, these wildflower plantings have a lot of aesthetic and educational value as well. This is another example of what one of these conservation covers plantings can look like. I really like this example from New Hampshire on a cranberry farm, because what it's showing is a conservation planting in the spring. And you can see it is definitely meeting that baseline requirement of having 3 different species blooming in the spring. And it's abundant. So this was a really nice seed mix because it's showing abundant bloom of 3 different species in the spring. This is another example, which often isn't a specific payment scenario in conservation cover, but it is a way to think about a different kind of habitat feature. So we have implemented this beetle bank, is what it's called, on an organic farm, Grinnell Heritage Farm in Iowa. And basically the concept is creating this pretty much grass cover. It's permanent. It's a permanent cover within a vegetable field, and it attracts these ground beetles. Ground beetles are really important predators of pest insects, but also of weed seeds. And when you create this cover within your crop fields, that brings in these natural predators, and they're dispersing into your crop fields. And so some states have actually started to develop a payment scenario. This is really cutting edge here. No states in the upper Midwest yet have a payment scenario for beetle banks specifically, but you could use one of the payment scenarios under conservation cover, just the native plant scenario, to build beetle banks on farms. So this is just another kind of opportunity. Organic farmers are constantly thinking out of the box, and this is something that you might help them kind of think through. Another new conservation practice that I just want to put on your radar, as far as I know, no states in the upper Midwest have yet adopted this practice, but I do think it is going to be a new opportunity for putting in a lot of pollinator habitat. It is called wildlife habitat planting 420. And so the purpose of this is to specifically establish wildlife habitat using herbaceous vegetation or shrubs. You can do this to improve habitat for a target wildlife species like monarchs, or to establish wildlife habitat that resembles a historic native plant community. So the idea here was to create a conservation practice that really allocates so that we can pull apart all those acres that are specifically going towards habitat plantings rather than just a basic conservation cover. So like I said, no states have yet adopted this. There's a lot that we're going to have to discuss in terms of what the scenarios are going to look like, but I do think there are going to be some really exciting opportunities here, and it's something that you should kind of keep on your radar for maybe fiscal year 2020 or even fiscal year 21. Shifting a little bit to more short-term, less permanent habitat opportunities, cover crops offer a really great, especially flowering cover crops, offer a really great opportunity for short-term bloom for a diversity of native pollinators and beneficial insects. I list here cover crops 340 as well as 645 because you're going to have to get to know your own state's program standards and what would be best for the specific farmer you're working with. Often the cover crop standard requires termination before the cover crop is really blooming. And so if bloom is really the key goal for the farmer you're working with, then you might be wanting to use upland wildlife habitat management, which allows a mixture of flowering forbs and it's going to allow them to bloom and provide that forage for the insects that you're trying to attract. This is a buckwheat planting, which is a real heavy hitter in terms of attracting a diversity of native insects. This is another way that cover crops could look. This is a mixture of cover crops that is intended for full season cover so that there's bloom succession. So you have blooms coming on early in the spring, like that canola, and maybe the field peas. Later in the season, you've got sunflowers and turnips blooming. So this is a full season cover, probably something more along the lines of a 645 planting. I just want to point out some of the key cover crops that we like to highlight because they are so attractive to a diversity of native insects. This buckwheat, any of the cole crops really, radishes, turnips, kale, canola, they're really great for attracting a variety of insects. Phacelia is another great one, sometimes used as smother crops in western states. And then partridge bee is another one that I really like. It's one of our native potential cover crop options. And if you're not familiar with this guide, this is another one of my favorite tools, Cover Cropping for Pollinators and Beneficial Insects. It's a free downloadable PDF that SARE primarily built, but Xerces had input on. And inside this guide is this long table outlining a lot of different cover crop options, and then it lists what those cover crop options, how they benefit honeybees specifically, native bees, and beneficial insects. So that's a great tool to get to know or to introduce to your organic farmers that you're working with. Another practice that is used broadly on organic farms is this field border 386. And like 327, it offers a few different scenarios. One of them, this is an organic farm that we work with in Montana. They have incorporated these field borders throughout their thousands of acres of crops. There's a diverse mix of native vegetation, pretty affordable, but native plants. And the important thing is that when you're creating these field borders, that they are protected from pesticide drift. And it's safe on this organic farm because it's surrounded by other organically managed land. This is another potential way to use the field border practice to create a strip of pollinator-friendly vegetation established at the edge or around the perimeter of a field. Pollinator-friendly vegetation in this case can just be clovers, really affordable mix. The idea here is that it's just a turnaround area. There's not a lot of traffic, but whatever you're putting in there can tolerate a little bit of traffic. But primarily, it's just a refuge area and a place that's growing a lot of pollinator-friendly forbs. Another way to use field borders is to create a strip of vegetation. And now I list here native, but it doesn't necessarily need to be native. To use it as a physical pesticide drift protection border. All organic farms are required to buffer their organic crops from pesticide drift. I like to use tall grass native species here because they get really tall. Some of them can get up to 8 feet tall. So they're creating that physical protection above ground, but they also have a vast fibrous root system that can really buffer pesticide drift moving below ground through the soil and through waterways too. So this is another potential way to create some habitat protection or on the farm using a conservation practice field border. Shifting to tree and shrub planting, so non-herbaceous plantings. Sometimes a farmer is looking for really early season bloom, and a lot of our native trees and shrubs could provide that early season bloom. Sometimes they want a windbreak or some other kind of hedgerow. The tree and shrub planting is a really great practice for doing that. Some common shrubs for nesting, if nesting resources are a deficiency. Elderberry, viburnums, box elder, sumacs, these are some of the shrubs that we know can be good nesting sites for native bees. Now, of course, you're going to have to become familiar with your own program standards. Probably no program standards offer box elder as a potential species to use, but it is something to know, that it's an important resource. So when you're out on the farm evaluating that habitat with the farmer and you see box elder, you might see that more as an asset than a nuisance. So just something to consider here. You could also use tree and shrub planting as a pesticide drift protection. So this is a non-flowering tree and shrub planting. So it's not going to attract pollinators to this area. Instead, it's going to kind of keep that pesticide drift from moving into the farm. This is a picture showing cedars. You'll have to get to know which species on your state list are available. This was taken in Minnesota, but since this photo was taken, I think red cedar was taken off of the potential list. So get to know your state standards. On this farm behind on the left off to the screen is a conventional corn and soy rotation. Then they have this tall coniferous drift protection buffer. And then on the right side, you can see here, this is an herbaceous pollinator planting strip. And then far off on the right side of the screen is an organic blueberry field. So these are different ways to use these conservation practices on organic farms. You might also try to use tree and shrub planting when establishing habitat from seed is just nearly impossible on an organic farm. This is a farm that has this low basin. It's pretty much full of reed canary grass. And in those kinds of cases, sometimes it's easier to just start with some more mature planting material. So we put in a diversity of native shrubs and trees here that will provide that early season bloom and a lot of benefits, but without having that multi-year fight with reed canary grass. And then one thing I really want to highlight is that depending on where you are, there is some amazing native habitat hiding on these farms. And putting in things from seeds, starting from scratch, is not necessarily the best way to go. Sometimes there is some really high quality habitat just hiding underneath some overgrown shrubs. This is a farm, there's a picture from a farm that I worked with in the driftless area in Wisconsin, where they just removed some cedars off this prairie bluff, and beneath it came this amazing plant community of high quality native flowers that really just don't show up in prairie seed mixes. We just don't know how to establish them. They're expensive seeds, and they have very high quality for bumblebees and other important kind of rare pollinators. So sometimes the existing seed bank is the most appropriate seed source. So getting to know your farm and all those nooks and crannies is really an important thing to do before throwing in habitat. These are some of the NRCS practices that can be used for just managing existing farm features rather than starting from scratch. You can just do forest stand improvements, do some burning and grazing. Often to implement some of these practices, you need to get somebody else involved, like a forester. But a lot of these different habitat kind of just management practices can be excellent ways to go to create to enhance pollinator habitat on a farm. And finally, if you just really feel like this is out of your realm, you could encourage a producer to go down the route of hiring a TSP, a technical service provider, to write a pollinator conservation activity plan, where that expert is going to come out to the farm and evaluate the site and suggest all of these different types of enhancements, and then they'll hand that off to you, the planner, and you can kind of work with the producer from there. So that's another potential option that you could introduce to farmers you're working with. Finally, just moving on to the conservation stewardship program. This is an option for farmers that are already doing a lot of conservation practices on their farm. It helps you build upon existing stewardship that you're doing, and I won't explain the entire stewardship program, but I do want to highlight a couple of key pollinator enhancement opportunities. One of them is this pollinator and beneficial insect habitat enhancement. I underlined the 327 just to denote that this enhancement, really the parallel is the conservation cover 327. They basically have, within EQIP, it basically has the same program standards. You need to have at least 9 species of flowering plants, 3 of those blooming in each bloom period, spring, summer, and fall. And whenever you're putting in these plantings, they do need to be protected from adjacent insecticide use, even if that's from the neighbor nearby. Likewise, there's a parallel monarch habitat enhancement, similar to the pollinator enhancement. However, in this enhancement, you have to include 1 species of milkweed, and it needs to make up a minimum of 1.5% of the seed mix. This habitat enhancement also needs to have 2 targeted monarch nectar plants for each bloom period. And likewise, it needs to be protected from insecticide use. The CRP program is something that in the past has been a really tremendous opportunity for creating a lot of pollinator habitat on farms. It is a program that is administered jointly by NRCS and FSA. They pay rent on the land that's taken out of production and put into the conservation practice. And it requires a contract of 10 or 15 years. And I do want to highlight the CP42 practice that was a huge boon for pollinator habitat in the last few years. Currently, there are no opportunities to enroll in this program, but it is worthwhile to point out how important it is, and that there may still be opportunities in the future if acres come out to enroll people into this program. So basically, it's very similar to the conservation cover 327 standard, where you need to have this diversity of flowers in blooms, covering different bloom times, spring, summer, and fall. They have to be all native species, and 75% plus of the mix needs to be native forbs. However, even though that CP42 is no longer available, there are a lot of other CRP practices that can accommodate some amount of pollinator habitat, even if it's just throwing in 1 or 2 native wildflowers, ones that are relatively cheap, that are known to establish well, and we'll put a few more flowering species out into the landscape instead of it being just a plain grass stand. So if this is an objective of the farmer you're working with to include some pollinator habitat, a lot of these practices can incorporate some level of flowering species. So to discuss that a little bit more, right now the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program is kind of an offshoot of CRP. It's not available ubiquitously. It's a program that partners with state, tribal, or local governments and the USDA. So the idea is that a landowner will enroll in a CRP practice, and currently all of the CRP practices that are available are water quality programs, CP21, CP23, CP2, and then once they enroll in that, then they also become eligible for a perpetual conservation program. And so, like I said before, some of these practices can be implemented by throwing in just 1 or 2 native flowering species that can create a lot of habitat and not add a lot of additional cost. So we're trying to fly through here and cover a lot of ground. I'm going to quickly kind of move into what that habitat restoration process can look like on an organic farm where things are slightly different. One thing to get familiar with is this organic site prep for wildflower establishment guide that the Xerces Society has put out a few years ago. We worked with a lot of farmers to trial various organic site prep methods. So the guide is available for free on our website as a downloadable PDF. Within the guide, there are about 7 different chapters, each kind of outlining 7 different organic site prep methods that we have experimented with. This page here that I'm showing you is kind of a quick reference guide. It's one of the first couple pages in. It basically outlines the 7 different practices: solarization, smother cropping, and so forth. It outlines when to use it, when not to use it, how it essentially works in a nutshell, and what equipment might be needed, and the relative cost of those materials. And then each chapter will go into more details about how to use it. And one feature I really like about this site prep guide is this appendix in the back that shows some kind of common cultivation or weed management tools. This is just a clip. There's actually a lot more materials here, but it's in the back. It just shows, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with organic tools, it's a really nice little appendix that's an added feature of this document. So to go through some of these, so solarization is one that we've spent a lot of time on. It's appropriate in some situations, sometimes it's not. It needs, in the upper Midwest, at least a full growing season. You need to use 4 to 6 mil UV stabilized clear high tunnel plastic. If you can use great, is great if you can find it. Basically, I'll go through all the steps here. So you'll cultivate or mow a seed bed, usually in the spring. Then you'll dig a trench around that perimeter and lay down the solarization plastic so that it's airtight. And you're going to leave that on all season long so that the sun is baking the ground and basically killing off weed seeds up to 6 inches down. At the end of the season, you'll remove that plastic in the fall, and broadcast your seed right on top of it as a dormant seeding. You're not going to do any more tillage after you remove the plastic. And what we found is that this is not effective against all weeds, but it can be quite effective if it's really in full sun and if you're primarily using it to control annual weed seeds. This is an example of how we've used this on an organic farm in Wisconsin. What you're looking at here are people on the left side of the screen. They're actually doing that dormant seeding, and they've flipped the plastic. So the plastic, where they're all walking is where the plastic used to be. Then they flipped it on the long edge. They're trying to get 2 years out of this same piece of plastic. So they flipped it over. That plastic is then going to go through the winter and go through another growing season. And they're going to do 2 different successions of this pollinator planting. And this is what it looked like after 2 years. So on the left, you've got that one that started a little bit earlier. It's already, after 2 years, creating a lot of different flowering resources. And then there's the first year planting where they're doing that maintenance mowing. In our experience in the upper Midwest, solarization has worked well on quackgrass, sometimes smooth brome, reed canary grass. Be cautious. If it's too wet, it might not really heat up well enough to be really effective against reed canary grass, but it works on Kentucky bluegrass, Canada goldenrod, and some other weeds that we've tried to control. It hasn't worked so well on some of those really persistent perennial weeds like Canada thistle, nutsedge. We are still learning about how solarization can and can't work in the upper Midwest. Another option would be smother cropping. This is essentially a high density cover cropping to outcompete weeds. You can either plant something that is really high density, like or high biomass creation, like sorghum Sudan grass or millet, or you could do something that has a flowering feature like buckwheat. You're really going to have to get to know your sites. The timing of when to use these, when to terminate them is really essential, and what species, what weed species you're really trying to control with these methods. One example of a way I've used this on a farm is in southeastern Minnesota. We did 2 seasons. This is a wet field, 2 seasons of sorghum Sudan as a smother crop. That second season, we chopped the sorghum Sudan, let it dry out like September to October. At the end of October, we did a prescribed burn to remove all that biomass to create a good seed bed for a dormant native seeding. And you can see there's still a little bit of vegetation there on the right, but basically it's all vertical and there's a clean seed to soil contact for that dormant seed that we spread. And we'll find out what the results are, because that was last fall. Another potential method to use on organic farms would be repeat cultivation. And I fully recognize that most of these site prep techniques are not great for our soil health in the short term. But the idea is that over the long term, we'll be gaining a lot in soil health. So I would only use repeat cultivation on really flat sites, on places where you have pretty short annual weeds, not a lot of perennial weeds, and where weed pressure is relatively low to begin with. And we have had success with this on some organic farms. Another option, which is sometimes tempting, is full soil inversion, because the idea here is to bury those weeds that you have on the surface and bring up clean subsoil. It can be tempting. I like to show this photo because I think it's an example of where you would not want to do soil inversion, which is on a crop field, which probably doesn't have too much weed pressure there. You really need to know what weed seeds you're working with and whether or not this would be appropriate. Soil inversion, I think, can work on flat sites, maybe in old pasture where it's relatively clean and weed-free, but I have seen this go horribly wrong on some organic farms where the mower plow really did not go deep enough, and instead it brought up a whole bunch of Canada thistle, which then created a Canada thistle mat, which becomes almost impossible to deal with on with organic methods. So use soil inversion cautiously if you're going to use it at all, is my advice. And like I said, organic farmers are kind of thinking out of the box. So some farmers have used other tools to do organic site prep. This is one where we've had really good success trying to manage quackgrass and reed canary grass just using pigs. They root things out. They do a really great job of eating those nasty rhizomes, and we've had good establishment of pollinator plantings afterwards. So these are options to consider when you're working with a farmer. And then finally, and maybe I probably should have put this slide at the very beginning, because before you plan where you're going to put your pollinator plantings, you really need to think about where those plantings will be most protected from pesticide drift. I do need to recognize that each state, each different program is probably going to have varying levels, varying standards for what that physical drift buffer needs to be. It also depends on what insecticides or pesticides are in the vicinity. So I'll just let you look at the standard. I know I'm running short on time here, so I'm going to keep moving there. We also have a new interseeding document for those areas that are primarily grassland and you want to try to enhance them with a few native wildflowers. This is a clip of the brochure, but we also have a full-length document that's a really neat document. I encourage you to go explore that.
And I'm just going to point out a few resources. If you have questions about organic site prep methods, Moses keeps a free organic answer line, so feel free to give us a call day or night. You can also drop us an email as well. If a producer has questions about transitioning to organic, Moses has a guidebook for organic certification. We also just updated the Midwest Organic Resource Directory if producers are looking for sources for organic cover crop seed. And we also print a free newspaper called the Organic Broadcaster that is covers all sorts of topics related to organic production. And if a producer is looking for more hands-on mentorship, we do have a farmer-to-farmer mentorship program. And again, not a Moses publication, but really helpful publication is the Biodiversity Conservation Guide, an Organic and Certifiers Guide printed by Wild Farm Alliance. Really a very helpful resource for on-farm biodiversity conservation.
We do have some more upcoming trainings. The first place I would go to is the Wisconsin Land and Water website to check out their online training. Some of them are online, some of them are in the field. Some of them have to do with pollinator habitat. Some of them are just more organic operation training opportunities. So they're all throughout August, and there are actually 2 slides here. So definitely go to the website.
The upcoming training on August 6th on organic row crop and cover cropping will be held at Mark Douglas' place. He also implemented a fair amount of pollinator habitat on his farm as part of a CSP enhancement over this last year. So you'll get an opportunity to take a look at some of his pollinator habitat there.
Again, just some more trainings, and would like to move on to questions if we even have any time. But so I highly encourage you to go to the Wisconsin Land and Water website to look at what training opportunities are available and to register. And I guess now, if we have time, we may be able to answer a few questions. I do see one question about beetle banks, and the first place I would go to is our website, or not our website. It is a book that it's one of our only resources that is not available as a free downloadable PDF. But it is a book. It's called Farming with Native Beneficial Insects. And in that book, it outlines what the whole premise of a beetle bank is and how you could build one. I know Oregon State is already well underway trying to develop a scenario for beetle banks under the Structures for Wildlife conservation practice. So this is something that's kind of catching on. We're doing some experiments in Iowa on some farms this season. to develop more resources for beetle banks in the upper Midwest. So certainly reach out to me specifically if you want to have a conversation about beetle banks, how you might implement them. I have a lot of ideas about how a producer could build them on their own really cost effectively, not necessarily with financial support through USDA. So feel free to reach out, but it is an upcoming kind of practice that I think we're looking into. Thanks for the question. Any others?
I think we're going to call it a wrap. Again, I sent out the evaluation link. If you can fill that out, that would be great. And thanks again, Karin and Caleb. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.